Monday, August 21st, 2023, Maneco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. This morning in my daily video, I said I'd have a special guest on to cover the BRICS summit starting tomorrow. Not just the summit, but also the history of the BRICS and what it means. And as I promised, Paul from the Sirius Report will be here with me today. Paul, welcome to the channel.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure as ever to catch up.
Great. And before we start, Paul, just wanted to let the viewers know that you can follow Paul on Twitter at the Sirius Report. He's got almost 156,000 followers, so he's very reputable and has a big following. And I also recommend his blog, where you can look at different subscription plans that he has. It's called the SiriusReport.com. I subscribe to it and I highly recommend it. Before we start, Paul, with the BRICS and all your knowledge and experience of this this grouping of nations, I wanted to just go over, talk a little bit about some of the coins I'm holding in my hand here, and especially because we see comments like from Jim O'Neill, who was the man from Goldman Sachs who coined the acronym BRIC back in, I think, 2001 or two. I'm not sure exactly what year. He's recently been interviewed or they talked to him at the FT on August 15th. And he said BRICS creator slams ridiculous idea for common currency. So, Paul, just to give you an idea, right now I'm holding a 20 franc gold piece from 1860. I've got now a $5 piece, gold piece from 1899. I've got right now an 1882 20 lira gold piece. I've got now a 20 franc gold piece from 1901 from Tunisia. I've got a gold sovereign with Queen Victoria from 1880. I've got, let's see here, a 20 gold marks piece from 1904. That's from the Empire of Germany. I've got a 10 ruble gold piece from 1899 with Tsar Nicholas. And I've got like a Saudi guinea, which looks like a sovereign in terms of weight and content. I don't know the year because I can't read Arabic. But my point here is, yes, it's probably ridiculous to have a common currency amongst potentially half the world's nations, but it's not really ridiculous to have currencies that are basically the same, i.e. gold. And it makes sense as well that all these BRICS nations and a lot of the global South nations have been buying a lot of gold in the last few years. So I just wanted to put that out there, and now I'll pass you the conch, so to speak.
Yeah. But you make an extremely valid point, and we'll come on to the whole issue of common currencies, payment systems, etc. But I thought it might be useful to do a little bit of a short sort of précis.
Sorry, Paul. Just to
sure.
I'm about to say, all these gold coins, and there were different names and different denominations. They're very much, pretty much the same size and weight. Yes, they have different contents, and and that's why we had exchange rates, because the coins of these nations, they were gold, but they were slightly different. So I'll stop now.
No, but it's a great point to make as well. So no problem. So yeah, there's lots of conjecture about when did the BRICS start to come to fruition. Now, I knew from sort of 2006 that the Western or the West and was going to experience what I would refer to as the Western financial crisis. It's not a global financial crisis. That was just to make everyone believe, oh, the whole world was suffering the same problems. No, it was primarily the problem for the West. Now, if you go back to 2006, what was the BRIC nations then? So Brazil, Russia, India, and China. They actually met on the sidelines. There was this debate at the UN Assembly. And in essence, that was kind of the birthplace of this alliance. Now, unsurprisingly, of course, 2008 happened. And then the first official summit was actually held in 2009. And initially, the kind of idea was, look, you know, we're going through this Western financial crisis. We need to improve global economics. We're going to have to look at reforming financial institutions. At that point, was it we reforming the World Bank, the IMF, et cetera, et cetera? But you know, at this point, they were just thinking there's clearly a serious problem, and this problem has been known to China and Russia, particularly since the mid-90s, when people I know approached and said, look, there's going to be a major financial crisis at some point, probably in the next 10, 15 years. And you need to start thinking about this. So that was kind of the embryonic birth of BRIC. Now, obviously, after this summit, they kind of said, oh, well, you know, maybe we need a new global reserve currency. And they didn't mention replacing the US dollar, because obviously that wouldn't have been a sensible thing to do. But that was the inference. Now, that's 2009. A lot changed. The idea that we now need a new global reserve currency is a bit of a myth. There doesn't need to be one. And we can explain some of the reasons why there isn't a need for it anymore. In fact, the argument is there should never have been one anyway in the first place. So 2010, South Africa becomes member, and then it becomes BRICS. And then they start to go, look, we need commercial, political, and cultural cooperation. And then in 2013, the member states said, look, we want to create a new global financial institution, effectively to rival, in inverted commas, the IMF and the World Bank. And that was the BRICS New Development Bank, as it was called. And at that point, their strategy was, we need some reform of the global monetary system. We want something that's more stable, more representative, of course, and more predictable. They wanted the reduction of the risk of the destabilization of currencies and stock markets. They wanted, even at that point, and this has been the key point all along, increase the use of national currencies in trade within BRICS nations. Also, cooperation with respect to world trade, strengthening of the BRICS exchange rate cooperation. They wanted their own independent ratings agency. So in essence, they were kind of coming out with a lot of what are now discussion points that are starting to get fleshed out. Now, in 2015, they created this BRICS contingent reserve arrangement. And that was supposed to provide protection against global liquidity pressures. So that included currency issues where members' national currencies were being affected by global financial events. When we've seen some of that, particularly in the last year or two, where many of these emerging market currencies are being slammed against the dollar. Even more reason why you'd want to trade with your neighbors in local currencies to iron out the risk of what, obviously, your devalued currency in dollar terms, if you have to trade in dollar terms, does for your economy. Now, the CRA was really, in essence, seen as a kind of alternative to the IMF. So the idea is BRICS nations and what we now call BRICS Plus or future associates could then operate independently in the event of a systemic global crisis. That's the key point to this. So everyone wants BRICS nations to run headlong into doing whatever they believe it should be. They're going to have a gold-backed currency, they're going to have all these things. And the important point to mention at this point in time, and I've said this before, they have to get this right. If they get it wrong, it could put back multipolarity 5-10 years. It won't kill it, but it will give it an enormous shot in the head in terms of its credibility. So very important they do that on that basis. And obviously, they started then talking about the development of what we know as the multipolar world and the idea that we can cooperate in trade, investment, finance. And China at that point put funds into this new development bank. And the idea we can finance this kind of global South operations, so developing countries can deal with all the challenges they face because, in part, not least, all the neo-colonialism, all being constantly screwed over, being at the behest of the dollar and all of the things we know to be a reality. So we kind of went through a period where not a lot was happening. And we seem to be treading water. I think nations have their own problems to deal with, and people going, oh, nothing's happening. I always made the point, look, at some point in the future, you'll start to see some big moves being made. Now, ironically, the Ukraine war was a huge accelerating factor, primarily because whoever made the mistake of saying, I know, not just sanction Russia's bank, let's sanction Russia's central bank and steal or freeze its assets. The biggest mistake the West has ever made, because that was the point that Russia had made all along. The risk is, for us, this could happen. And then all these other global South nations going, well, this could happen to us. So we need to accelerate getting out of using the dollar, having dollar-denominated debt, but also, of course, back to that point, we have to use local currencies. And the first step was always using local currencies in a mature way. So in a bilateral sense. It might be multilateral. It could be in some capacity, depending on if nations, for example, in the Eurasian Economic Union, will utilize the ruble. And therefore, it's not bilateral, then it becomes multilateral. Okay, the argument that other institutions like the ASEAN nations would maybe just utilize the yuan exclusively isn't going to be the case. The idea is countries in that ASEAN organization can utilize local currencies. And that's why in the last 18 months, we've seen this big explosion of nations de-dollarizing. So they're now going, like, take India. Yeah, India, of course, was kind of forced into local currencies with Russia to trade oil, but they're not forced into it in trading for energy with the UAE, for example, which is being done in rupees and dirhams. And the argument as well is, well, China and Saudi Arabia can trade in each other's currencies. And there's this big myth that you need the dollar as an intermediary. You don't need the dollar as an intermediary. So we kind of go through this process where we're talking about global economic governance, the change to it, and advancing trade and having what I would call true liberalization, true globalization, not the mythical globalization that exists in the West. And the idea is, okay, at some point, we'll admit new countries, and we're going to see the integration of what we in the West term emerging markets and so-called emerging nations. So there's a whole bunch of BRICS summits going on right through 2015 to 2022, when there was and people can look back at the history. I don't think there's much value in regurgitating, the kind of discussions that went on. But what I think is worth noting is if you go to last year's BRICS summit, that was actually attended, apart from the BRICS nations, by leaders from Algeria, Argentina, Egypt, Indonesia, Iran, Kazakhstan, Cambodia, Malaysia, Senegal, Thailand, Uzbekistan, Fiji, Ethiopia, and the list goes on and on. And the basis is they wanted to be part of developing a multipolar world based on all the principles that we've just discussed as kind of the basis of BRICS in the future. So global trade, access to global finance, so it's not having to deal with politically motivated dollar and politically motivated IMF and World Bank. And obviously the expansion of BRICS into this BRICS Plus format potentially allows countries all over the global South including Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, to join. Now, there's an argument Western nations could join. Okay, it's not going to happen at this point in time, but at some point in the future, who knows, that may happen. So the argument are BRICS really trying to establish a new reserve currency? No, there's no point. But what they're looking at, and this is still a huge discussion piece, is can we create a currency that would work, particularly if we're going to bring all these other nations in, and how are we going to integrate these other nations? What does it mean? Are we going to establish a payment system? Well, we'll come on to there's a payment system that's been developed for quite a long time called BRICS. It's been going for about 6 years. And there's more developments going on pretty quietly with regards to that. But the question is, okay, can we have not just a payment system? Is there a way we can create a currency for trading within BRICS nations? Would it be backed by gold? Could it be backed by commodities? And these are ongoing discussions. And then, of course, people jumped on the fact that India said, well, we're not really discussing this. Well, no, they're not discussing that particularly. The primary focus at the moment is how do we increase trading in local currencies? But remember, that's the first important step. And in terms of the process of de-dollarizing, the process of having, financial independence, economic independence, and being able to, establish a reliable alternative for international payments, i.e. outside the purview of SWIFT. So we need to build some joint financial infrastructure that would enable us to have a currency, in inverted commas, whatever that will mean in the future, to be created to reduce reliance on the dollar and the euro. Now, there's a lot of semantics going on where nations are coming out going, we're not trying to de-dollarize, but we want nations to use local currency. That is de-dollarizing. They're just trying to not overtly antagonize the United States. But let's be honest, the United States knows exactly what these nations are doing, and it is de-dollarization. And it's, use that rather horrible, crude analogy of, for the dollar, it's death by 1,000 cuts. It's like, Russia and China exclusively trade in local currencies, and then we start to expand it in terms of international trade. Eventually, there comes a point where far more of global trade is conducted in non-dollar terms than in dollar terms. And then the argument is, well, the dollar is no longer what you would term a world reserve currency. I mean, if it only conducts 20% of global trade, it's not a world reserve currency anymore. And this is why also we come back to this point that there can be multiple currencies created that will serve the needs of nations. And it will be, people don't like the term digital currencies because they think it means all manner of things. Well, digital currencies will be utilized in wholesale transactions, not retail, meaning you and I. It's not like you and I will have to trade in BRICS currencies. That will be used for international trade. But the ASEAN countries might do it. Russia's developing the digital ruble. China has the digital yuan. And there are many, many different permutations. At this point, there is nothing clear as to exactly what will transpire from BRICS. The idea that they're going to announce a gold-backed currency. Now, we can never say never, but put it this way, I would probably fall off my chair if it was to be announced, because even if it was, it would be the completely wrong time to do it. There is not enough development in terms of the overall strategy of having local currencies. But of course, there's BRICS initiative in the last year and a half. Yes, it's grown hugely. There's a whole raft of nations, maybe 20, 30, 35, who'd like to join. But what does it mean to join? What's the expectation? What's the belief in terms of what BRICS could offer? Well, and if you offer alternative financial architecture, then it's a bit like saying at some point when SWIFT was created, well, where's the demand for this? Who's going to join? Well, everyone was by and large was forced to join. So, and I'm not suggesting people will be forced or nations will be forced to join. The point is, if you get 50 nations who all utilize an alternative financial architecture, you have to take it seriously. And they can do it and they'll want to do it. Why? Because there's nothing the United States can do in terms of sanctioning them. They can't coerce them, they can't threaten them. And if they're outside the IMF and the World Bank, that's obviously extremely good news for nations who no longer have to go with a begging bowl. And we know what happens in terms of austerity, and nations get wrecked and then their assets all get effectively stolen for a cent on the dollar or whatever it is. But clearly, there are nations now who want to trade outside SWIFT. They want alternatives. They want a mechanism that means they can use payment systems that are far more effective, they're far cheaper, far quicker, and it allows them to have far more control rather than having to be at the behest, as we said, of US Germany, the US dollar, SWIFT, etc. So there are nations who would have joined, like to have joined yesterday. Saudi's one of them. Iran's another one of them. But it's worth putting into context people who go, well, BRICS is a white elephant. Well, it constitutes roughly 40% of the global population, probably a bit higher, about 25% of global GDP. I would argue, when we look at all the mythical GDP in the West, it's probably 30%, maybe even higher. And if we look at the GDP of BRICS nations, it's higher now than the G7. It has about 30% of the global landmass and is already 22, 23% of global trade. So the idea where we can dismiss it as being pointless, but also collectively, what do they have? Enormous amounts of natural resources, fossil fuels, precious metals, rare earths, minerals, hard, soft commodities, so including, of course, agriculture. So if we assess the future expansion of BRICS Plus, it could then control over half of oil and gas reserves, and it would have a GDP well in excess of the US, well, the mythical US GDP, of course, because US GDP in reality is 50% of what it is now. So then how does BRICS Plus, what does it do? It can integrate with China's Belt and Road, the Eurasian Economic Union, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the ASEAN countries, there's the RCEP, there's obviously all the financial and trade institutions that exist in Africa, and the list goes on. There's dozens of them. And they all potentially have the capability to all integrate with each other. And if they can utilize a financial architecture, then that is a very compelling reason for them to go, well, hang on. We want what it's good for us to be part of BRICS. There are beneficial reasons for us to do so. So why would we not do this? And collectively, we have resources. In the future is about resources. He who has the resources is going to be set first. So, it's ironic, of course, that in the West we upset and anger the Russians and the Iranians, who actually can provide the West with an abundance of cheap energy. I mean, talk about the most idiotic, sort of myopic kind of perspective, that we didn't kind of go, hang on, we're heavily dependent on those. Okay, we've got our differences and we're not going to roll over and just agree with them. But on the other hand, we need to be mindful of the fact that they potentially are going to have a huge influence and impact in the future. And if you can get your energy very cheaply, you're going to have a less of an inflationary problem. Where in the West, we're buying energy 4 or 5 times the cost. That's going to have an inflationary problem because, as we know, energy is the lifeblood of nations. So, in essence, the scope of BRICS, it can include non-US loan credit rating systems. You can have commodity price, and they could set up their own commodity exchanges, trade settlement mechanisms. That may be possible that's where the gold component comes in. It could be settled in gold, for argument's sake, and this is why the Global South is buying up enormous amounts of gold, because they know gold will have some component in terms of a new financial system, and Okay, what does that mean in terms of BRICS? As we said, is it going to be gold backed or isn't it? We don't know at this point. But what I would say is, if you go back probably 5 years ago, the BRICS nations were discussing the possibility, and this is where maybe I think some of the confusions come in, a separate gold note trading system. Because obviously we've got, like, for example, London and New York and maybe some degree in Switzerland. So what they said is we can have new trading hubs here. Now, Russia's now got the Moscow Exchange. China, we know, has got Shanghai Gold Exchange. India, very obvious. And therefore, they could have a possibility of establishing a single gold trade, both within BRICS and at the level of bilateral contacts between BRICS nations. So why is that beneficial? Because BRICS nations have substantial reserves of gold. They also produce quite a lot and they consume quite a lot. So it makes sense to have their own benchmarks. We know, going back, I think 2018, that the Bank of Russia signed a memorandum on developing bilateral gold trade with China. And that was to form a single trade system with the PBOC. So this is where this kind of discussion of gold came about. So therefore, the argument is we don't utilize the West anymore for this purpose. So gold buyers can decide where they want to purchase it from. And therefore, if we have an alternative system, then market participants can make deals on our own international exchanges. And this is why, in part, we're seeing all these nations buying up huge amounts of gold, not least as part of de-dollarizing, as part of dumping US treasuries to buy gold. And not contrary to conventional wisdom, there aren't foreign buyers of US treasuries. It's a myth. There are buyers who people claim are foreign buyers just because an account in the Cayman Islands bought it. Who says that's foreign buyers? And something I've started to mention in recent times is also, when we look at all the data, why is there never a list of treasury holders in the United States? And apparently, we're supposed to believe no one in the United States holds US treasury. Of course, we know that's not true. So where are their treasury holders? And this is exactly the point of, like, the Cayman Islands and the UK, etc. So we're not drifting into treasuries per se, but I'm mentioning that as an important point. So this is why we're seeing huge amounts of gold buying going on. There's official gold buying, unofficial gold buying. And what I mean by that is there is an opaque market where enormous amounts of gold has been shifting from west to east since 2011. And it's ongoing. It's not as big as it was in 2012, 13, 14, but that's because there isn't the amount of gold available to do it anymore. But most certainly, this is a feature we're going to continue to see. In terms of this BRICS pay system, that is obviously digital based. It's developed by the BRICS nations. And what it wants to do is enable digital payments between the different countries in this BRICS format. It will allow businesses to utilize it. Again, it's to make and receive payments, but note in local currencies. Again, it reduces cost, the complexity of utilizing international payment systems that might throw you into the long grass and sanction you 5 minutes later. We know exactly who that is. And, it's a secure, reliable way to pay for goods and services. So, in essence, that's a kind of brief synopsis of where we've been, where we are. I understand the excitement of why people want to believe there's going to be an announcement. At this point, there isn't. And the idea that they're publicly being very careful how they phrase it, in terms of also saying, look, we're not de-dollarizing, even though they are, because they're kind of very cognizant of the fact, well, some nations still, that they don't want to be seen to be overtly aggressive with the US, although the US's ability to react now is pretty minimal, because what are they going to do? Sanction 60 nations in the world? As we've seen with Russian sanctions, it's a bit of a myth, because when Western nations want Russian oil or whatever else, they just get it anyway. But still, you've got to be cognizant and mindful of the fact you don't push the boat too soon. You've got to make sure this system works right. And if they're going to integrate another 20 members in the next 6 months, year, 2 years, whatever that might be, and then what does that mean? And how do you give a weighting in terms of commodities? How do you have a gold component to it? What will that involve? It's complex decisions. And again, you've got to get this right. If they get it right, then that will be an enormous shot in the arm for an alternative financial platform. And let's bear in mind one thing. This isn't about technology. The technology is like shelling peas. It's about making sure that technology works in a way that's advantageous, it's cost effective, and it suits the member states. And of course, BRICS can morph into many different things aside from what we've spoken about. But it might be some natural kind of situation where BRICS nations will then join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I don't think BRICS is ever going to be what might be deemed military in context, but there might, of course, also be an overlap with nations in the BRICS who might trade with each other, but they're also members of ASEAN or the Eurasian Economic Union. And then, what happens then? Do they trade with each other in BRICS? Are they going to trade with each other in the ruble, in the Eurasian Economic Union, et cetera, et cetera? So there's huge amounts of things that need to be agreed upon. Ukraine war was a huge catalyst in this regard, ironically, but it was a necessary catalyst because it comes back to the fundamental point. All these nations understand the precarious nature of the Western financial system. Therefore, it's in their interest to get out of it as fast as possible. So the least you trade in it, the better. Okay, there's going to be some nations you'll have to trade in the dollar with, but for other global South nations, how much trade do they have with nations who are going to demand dollars? Probably relatively little. For some, it's a bigger problem. But in general, we're finding situations now where nations are able to settle their debt obligations, even though it's notionally in dollars in yuan. Argentina being an example. People said that's impossible. Well, of course it's possible. So it's getting into a situation where you're limiting your exposure to the Western financial system, but also limiting as much as possible your exposure to the IMF, the World Bank, and becoming part of something that will insulate you. Because if you collectively as a global South work together and have as little involvement, then it's going to impact you less when the inevitable Western crisis of economies, financial systems comes to pass. Now, no one has a crystal ball when that will happen, but they are cognizant of that as well. But that doesn't mean just because you perceive something to happen quickly that you're then going to go, we need to run headlong through the door. We need to start making all these changes rapidly. So there's going to be discussions, and here's the thing, it's a democracy. It's not the United States turns up and tells NATO countries, this is what we're doing, and you'll all agree, and when we say how high do you jump, you'll jump that high. They will have disagreements. They will have a different perspective, different viewpoints, and that's to be encouraged because that's the world of adults, where we do have multilateral organizations where countries can express freely their viewpoints and reach consensus. And, in the future, there might be nations who go, I don't want to be part of BRICS. Well, fine, just leave. That's their prerogative. It's not a problem. But ultimately, the question is that a foolish thing to do? And from my perspective, it would be foolish for global South nations. And just a final point with regards to India. India's just playing both sides. They want the best of everything. So if they can get something out of the US, they'll get it. But the idea they're trying to destroy BRICS, etc. Well, if they're so keen on trying to be jump into the other camp, why are they trying to persuade the world to trade in rupees and not dollars? That's hardly jumping into the other camp. They just feel, well, there's beneficial reasons to still be friends with the Americans, and the truth is, at some point, the US will change, and it'll be beneficial for the world to work and cooperate with the newborn United States whenever that happens. But it's always black and white. If they do this, it means this. It's almost like if you say something that's critical of the West perspective over the Ukraine war, then you're a Russian sympathizer. It's just all this very binary thinking. There is no binary thinking in all this. It's very complicated, very complex, and there are many things that need to be ironed out. The fundamental basis is the more current nations who trade local currencies get outside dollar-denominated debt, etc., aren't at the behest of the IMF and the World Bank. That's an enormous step towards getting out of the very system that effectively is causing huge damage for decades, as we all know.
Yeah, that was a very good synopsis, and I would say that the from what you told me, the BRICS, it's almost like a more representative version of the UN, but it's more for trade and payments, and the fact that I think more than 60 nations have been invited to the summit is quite telling. That's like getting up there, and with that, I wanted to talk a little bit about uh, all the naysayers and all the stuff that we've been hearing now in the last month or 6 weeks about China collapsing, a deflationary collapse in China, just because they had a CPI that was down 0.4 year on year. I see their GDP, though, still growing at 5%. I see that their yield curve for government bonds still upward sloping, which is not pointing to a recession. We're seeing also a lot of talk about Russia and its currency going down, and also I think Jim O'Neill in the FT article says that as long as China doesn't become more friendly with India, BRICS will never work. But then I heard also, I listened to a little clip the other day that if you add all the Latin American countries, their GDP is 2 times that of India, and their population is a third of India. So, yeah, what do you say to these naysayers? And they're naysayers even in the alternative, people who are very pro gold. They can't seem to imagine that these countries can get their act together and cooperate to find an alternative. I don't even think they want to attack the dollar, but they will indirectly by not using the dollar. I think that's what it's all about. And the other thing I would say before I let you counter is that I'm not expecting this summit to drive the price of gold up. And that's not why I buy gold. The reason I buy gold is that whenever there are fiat currencies out there, it's very difficult to trust governments and central banks. So it's always good to have some. But it's interesting that these countries, of course, have been buying a lot of gold. Russia, I think, since '06. And there's a lot of speculation that Russia and China have a lot more gold than the official figures tell us. So this is like a part two to what I'm saying. Do you remember in March, I think Xi Jinping made his first trip abroad this year to Moscow. And when he left the Kremlin, there was a little clip that went viral, and they said to each other, "Yeah, we are doing something that hasn't been done in 100 years." So maybe that's why there's a lot of speculation about the BRICS summit.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, they are doing. This is revolutionary. It's this big paradigm shift in saying there should be an alternative. We don't subscribe to unipolarity, and neither does the global South. The unipolarity has benefited the United States and some of its satellites to some degree. But the global South has commodities, it has real wealth, and you've exploited it in the most abusive kind of way. So, yeah, I mean, you can see why people would perceive that. But again, it's timing. Things. People are very impatient and want to see something happen yesterday rather than understanding the complexity of why that's not possible. But coming back to China, look, for 20 plus years, all I've ever seen is China's going to collapse. China's going to collapse. here's the point, and we've discussed this previously, and I've been at pains to discuss this for probably 5 years. China is going through this massive rotation in its economy, where it doesn't want to manufacture cheap goods anymore. And because the people in the country don't want to do these jobs, they want better paid jobs, because this is part of raising the standard of living and taking 800 million Chinese out of poverty into middle class. And they, contrary to the Western idea that China's this dictatorship, Xi Jinping spends every day of his life going, if I don't do things that benefit the Chinese people, our governmental system will collapse. Now, that's not because the Chinese people threaten the government or Beijing, but they have expectations and demands, and they want a better standard of living. They want better quality jobs. So therefore, if you're going to do that, you have to have this rotation where China goes from being somebody who was basically manufactured all the cheap goods and exported them to the world. We know that's been the case since they were admitted to the WTO. But they don't want to do that anymore. And this has been a stated policy. So when you're going through this massive rotation in your economy, so you become more consumption-based, you're moving into more high-tech sectors, you're then going around the world buying up assets and wanting to derive benefit from that in doing that, and that's, of course, what they're doing, then you're going to have situations where your employment shifts, where there'll be sections of people unemployed, and this is a normal process. But the West is somehow going, well, China, and then because they're still fixated that China's only can succeed by selling cheap rubbish to the West. This is nonsense. The idea as well that China's banks will collapse. The major banks are state-owned. How on any level of understanding or comprehension is a state-owned bank going to collapse? The other thing is China has enormous forex reserves. It doesn't have 3 trillion, it's probably got 12 trillion. It has enormous gold reserves. I've said this before. It has about 40,000 tons. I mean, it's been producing 600 metric tons every year for 20 years at least. That gold never leaves the country. That's 12,000 tons straight off. Never mind the enormous amounts of gold that was being purchased, between 30,000 tons in a 2.5-year period, 1,000 tons a month, headed into China and Hong Kong. Most of it ended up in mainland China. And how much of that is left? Well, okay, some of it has, and some of it's being bought by the Chinese people, etc., but a huge amount of it stays. The idea that China has 2,000 tons or whatever is just nonsense. So there's this very poor understanding of the West about anything to do with China, about its economy, about its financial system, how China's this massive surveillance state, how the social credit system, which doesn't exist for all people, that's a myth. And the list goes on. So there's all this idea that everyone who are these experts in the West about China are looking at China like it's the West, and it's nothing like the West. Does China have problems? Yeah, because it's going through this huge rotation. It's also going through, and it has been for years, in sorting out its commercial real estate sector, which is a mess. But remember Evergrande? Evergrande's going to be China's Lehman moment. Well, we said at the time, this is nonsense. And here we are, it wasn't their Lehman moment. Because again, it's poor understanding. This is more wishful thinking by people who hate China for whatever reason. Okay, let them hate China. If they want to waste huge amounts of time and effort in purely disliking China because some ideological reason or personal reason, for whatever reason, that's fine, just leave them to it. Yeah, China's got problems, but compared to the West, I made a tweet earlier, if we think China's hitting the wall, we hit the wall at 120 miles an hour in 2008. And we've been in the ICU and effectively since then, and in a totally vegetative state with all the things of just endless money printing, all these ludicrous asset bubbles that don't justify the value they are, and endless credit, and just endless fake data. The whole thing's just an illusion. We should be more worried about the mess we have. But the reason I'm trying to switch focus to China and trying to switch focus to Russia is fear. because they're fearful that the rise of multipolarity is that China and Russia are going to do to us what we did to them. And they're not going to do anything of the sort because A, what's the point? B, they're intelligent enough to realize that in the end, the same fate is going to await you. You cannot go around the world abusing relationships the way we have, particularly the United States and also Britain, in terms of geopolitical decisions, foreign policy decisions. So they're not going to do that. But the West is obsessed that that's what they're trying to do. So they're desperate to believe anything means the collapse of China.
Yeah, it's like they think the Chinese are into the Hegelian dialectic, it seems to me.
Yes. And nothing could be, that's not the Chinese mentality at all. And this is why, as well, of course, the West idiotically went, we're going to sanction Russia in 2-3 weeks, a month. Russia will collapse, the ruble will collapse, Putin will be gone, and then multipolarity is dead. And because they knew nothing about Russia's internal economy, its financial system, about the Putin and how the Russian people perceive him as a leader. They know nothing about the internal dynamics of the country at all. They still think it's like the 1980s there. And again, the same nonsense with China. They don't understand anything. They are just almost got to the point that everyone's now believing the nonsensical propaganda that we've been spewing about these countries, which was, designed for people like us to believe. But the people in positions of power and influence, in inverted commas, they're now believing it themselves. And this is why the West screwed itself over with regards to sanctions. That's why I made the point on the day the war started. If the West is serious about imposing the sanctions it's claiming, the West will collapse. Because they don't understand the dynamic of what Russia's relationship with the West is, how the West depends on cheap Russian energy, and also, of course, the West can't get round their head. Well, why is Russia so popular in the rest of the world? The rest of the world we deny exists. Why? Look at the African nations. 49 out of 54 goes to the Russia-Africa summit. They love Russia because Russia's never done anything colonial to damage them. They want cooperation. And the West cannot get its head around this. It doesn't understand. It doesn't grasp that, hence for Newland to go to Niger because the West panicking and trying to tell, in Niger, look, the Wagner's here, they're to destabilize your country. They're trying to exert Russian influence. And these nations are just laughing at the West, going, what are you talking about? They've liberated our countries from your neo-colonialism. And so these are all the fundamental points now with regards to Russia's currency against, the ruble against the dollar. Well, how relevant is it? How much trade do we see between the dollar and the ruble? Well, basically nothing. And when the ruble was strengthening against the dollar, it's meaningless. And now, but when it weakened, the ruble's collapsing. There's no confidence in the ruble against the dollar. And how much manipulation was going on to try and trash the ruble against the dollar. I mean, the argument can also be, is it just a coincidence? Okay, to some extent, China's quite happy for the yuan to weaken. Maybe not as high as 7.3 against the dollar. Was there a bit of manipulation at the same time to try and trash the yuan to make, look, you can't trust these countries. Look how useless their currency is. This is all optics to make the global south go, you can't trust them. You need to trust us. Remember, even though we've abused our relationship with you forever, in some cases hundreds of years, you still want to be with us. And they're going, no, we don't. And they understand what's going on. And they better understand what China's doing and how China now is leading in new technologies, is the biggest generator of new patents. And no, they're not stolen from the West. All this, yeah, one time China stole everything. We know this, but they don't do this anymore. So they are going through this rotation, and maybe for a year or two, their economy might not grow at 5%, maybe it grows at 2%. But who cares? Well, only the West cares and is fretting about this. The Chinese aren't losing sleep because they know also they're rotating away to different markets. So their markets with the global south are growing, and their markets with the United States and Europe are dwindling. But everyone doesn't seem to understand. The reason China's exporting less stuff to the United States is because there isn't the demand in the US, because the US economy is cratering, contrary to conventional wisdom. The US economy is in such a strong position. And everything these people in the West throw at the Chinese about their economy, their financial system, well, why aren't they looking at home? Because things were a lot worse here. But apparently it doesn't matter because we have the dollar and the dollar makes us immune to everything. Well, that's no longer the case. And it comes back to the point. The US wanted a war between Russia and Ukraine to be a proxy in that regard. They want a war between China and Taiwan. Why? Because US hegemony is on its knees. It's over. And that's their last chance to go. If we can destroy Russia and China, who we see as the backbone and the architects of multipolarity and this alternative vision for the world, if we get rid of them in some capacity, we weaken them, then the rest of the world will fall back into line because they'll go, well, without China and Russia, we can't do this. Now, there's an argument to say to some extent that could be true, but I mean, they're not going to destroy Russia. It's failed. They're not going to destroy China. This is just ideological nonsense go around in the heads of people in the West. So we just have to be far more objective. And when I see people constantly attacking China, they're often people who are very pro the United States, pro the dollar, pro the dollar. You know, Germany's going to exist for another 30, 40, 50 years. You know, it's got, you know, these other nations can't challenge us. Well, what have we got in the West? We just have all this mythical nonsense with, as you said, endless debt, asset bubbles that are totally unsustainable. We have huge problems in derivatives markets and also just in the fact of our bond markets, etc., etc.
Deindustrialization as well.
Yes, and yes, exactly. And
big government, ironically, because you know the Chinese are supposed to be the communists, but government government spending in the West is going out of control. The national debt is going out of control. And I just brought up here Thucydides' trap, which you're probably familiar with, which is this theory that like a waning empire will try to resist a rising power. And is that something that you could see in the next 2 years? The US get even more aggressive in trying to disrupt not just China and Russia, but the whole BRICS experiment. And I noticed as well on the alternative and the right alternative, you know, the right wing alternative, people who are like pro small government, they're very anti-China, and they say, oh, China is expanding its military and stuff, but China is like population is, I don't know, about 5 times that of the US. It's a huge country. It needs a military. And if you look here, countries with the highest military spending worldwide, the US has more military spending than China and all the other countries put together. So, yeah, what's your take on this? Do you think they're going to try? I guess they will try to stop this, but personally, I think it will fail.
Look, we're at this point where things, in some ways, because there's a lot of people who think multipolarity started in 2022. It didn't. It's been going for 20 plus years. In very small ways, very quiet ways, lots of discussions. You know, the Ukraine war is a great example. What was the first thing that happened almost a matter of months after the original Maydan? Russia and China signed the holy sort of grail energy deal, as it was called, and it was all to be traded in dollar term. It's no coincidence this happened. So there's a whole bunch of processes going on for a great many years. So the idea that suddenly this has all come out of nowhere and people are overstating the strength of the United States globally and underestimating the strength of the global South. Now, the problem is, what can the United States realistically do? it can't. The idea it can sanction the world now. Well, the world's looked at Russia, the global south, and gone, look, we can find ways to circumvent sanctions. I mean, Russia's done it very easily. Okay, and with cooperation of other nations, of course, which is necessary. So the idea that you can sanction nations, apart from it being seen as a political statement, it carries no claims. So the alternative we look at is, well, what's the US going to do? It's never going to declare war on Russia, because if it declares war on Russia, then it's World War III. The United States does not want World War III because it knows what the consequences of World War III will be. Hence, it likes to fight Russia with proxies. Okay, it might slightly bend the rules in what proxies mean, but as far as the rules of engagement are, it's still proxies. The United States officially put US forces in Ukraine. That's a different matter. So war is not an option. And if things continue to play out in Ukraine the way they are, and Ukraine, as things stand, will lose the war now, okay? It could change tomorrow or next week, but that's unlikely. But let's just work on the basis that Ukraine loses the war and Russia then effectively has the whip hand in negotiations. The damage that will do to NATO is catastrophic. The damage it will do to the US's reputation is catastrophic. The damage it will do to the military-industrial complex is catastrophic, because all these game changers in Ukraine are failing. They're all getting just obliterated. So they're not game changers. And people are looking at going, why am I going to buy Western military hardware? There's no point, because it's useless. It's garbage. So the ramifications of that is, what's going to then happen with Taiwan and China? Is the United States, who's going to be its proxy there? It's an island off the coast of China. It's not landlocked like Ukraine was to NATO countries like Poland, for example. It's a completely different situation. And there are increasingly people in the US going, if we lose this war against Ukraine, effectively indirectly, we've not got a chance of fighting a war with China and Taiwan. If China just doesn't do anything, nothing will happen. Because it's not like there are warring parties inside Thailand between maybe what you would call ethnic Taiwanese and ethnic Chinese. None of this is happening. It's a completely different situation. And no one in NATO is going to go, I know, yeah, we're going to ship arms to Taiwan. How are you going to get it to Taiwan? It's just not reality. It's not feasible. So what alternatives does the US have? It's not going to declare war on China for the same reason it wouldn't declare war on Russia. So if it can't go to war, what can it do? I mean, and it's always the situation. The rest of the world will just go, we're doing our own thing. You have the dollar, fine. If you want us to trade with you using the dollar, fine. But you know what? We're not going to use the dollar. The global south, with 90% of the world's population, etc., we're going to use our own system.
And also, if the US wants to buy something from another country, they'll have to have their currency as well, I would say.
Well, yes, and that's the point. If the US wants resources, well, they'll just say, well, pay in this currency.
You have to earn real, or you have to earn...
or whatever it is. And here's the thing. There was a rumor that came out that, the US is trying to get Israel and Saudi Arabia to have reproachment, because the US is looking at the Middle East going, we've just lost complete control of it. And they're trying to in some way go, well, maybe if we can have reproachment between those two, and then it'll look like we're not completely being pushed out of the region. Now, the claim is that, the Saudis said, well, if we have reproachment, we want all these things. And one of the things the rumor said was the United States said, you must promise never to trade with China in US for oil. Now, I could believe that's true. The fact is Saudi won't take any notice, but what that tells us, the fragility of the dollar, that tells us how panic-stricken the United States is, that if the world stops using the dollar, it's game over, and it is. And that's the only thing that's kept the United States from collapsing, because of its ability to abuse that exorbitant privilege. Well, those days are over. So if it can't abuse its exorbitant privilege, it doesn't have the military capability or desire to go, because war now, a world war isn't what a world war is, as we know, in 1939 and 1914. So what options do they have? They're extremely limited. And they can't say to the world, well, 50, 60 nations, I'm sorry, you're not allowed to use this new financial platform. You're not allowed to use a BRICS currency or a BRICS payment system. You can't do this, you can't do that. I'm just turning and go, sorry, we are. What are you going to do? Sanction? Well, fine, if you sanction us all, we'll just all trade with each other because we don't need you anymore. And in fact, all sanctions are doing is isolating the United States on a world stage. It's causing nations like Saudi and Iran, who've been in talks for years about rapprochement, to seal the sort of put the signature on rapprochement, officially announce it. Dot I's, cross T's. We're seeing all these big changes because they're going, we're sick of your bullying. So the more you try to bully us, the more you're pushing us towards each other. And hence Syria back in the Arab League. And we're seeing developments that people said would never happen. And well, here's the thing. All these developments people don't believe are happening. Well, it's the same with BRICS and the BRICS currency or BRICS payment system. Exactly the same principle that all these things will happen. They are going to happen. But again, I use this thing, and people get annoyed when I say this, but it's reality. Nothing's time-driven. It's event-driven. Meaning, certain things have to happen in certain ways, and then someone will push the button and go, okay, now's the time to do this. And the event-driven thing is, like we said, you have to have mature adult discussions about what's the BRICS going to be. Yeah, there's huge desire to join, and we know why nations want to join, but what does that mean? How are we going to make this work? How are we going to ensure it does work and it's robust and people will have confidence to utilize it? And we don't need to sink the dollar. The dollar will sink itself because of US foreign policy, because of US attitudes. And the US will become an irrelevant currency as a world reserve currency because, here's the thing. Who's the US going to trade with in the future in dollar terms? Europe, to some degree, yes. But who else? Japan, maybe South Korea. But then those nations are going to start going, hang on. If we're going to trade with the rest of the ASEAN nations, they're going to go, sorry, we're not trading in dollars anymore. We're using this currency. Oh, okay, we'll have to trade in local currencies with. So in the end, it just diminishes the actual uptake of the usage of the dollar, and then the situation becomes where nations no longer have dollar-denominated debt. Why would you do that? And people are going, well, it's impossible. And China needs to open its economy up. China needs to open its financial system and its capital markets. Well, it is doing, but very cautiously, because it knows if it opens and it's a free-for-all, and the West piles in, and the West is desperate to pile in, including the big banks, because they know that that's the future, and they can obviously profit enormously because they know what's going to happen in the West. You want to be extremely careful in that you don't do it too sudden, too soon, and you create huge internal problems for China as a nation. But certainly when the investment's right, and China is still attracting inward investment, it will happen. But it has to be done in a mature way, whereas we in the West just jump in head first. We go, right, Russia's invaded Ukraine, right, sanction everything, sanction anything with the word Russia in it. And instead of going, hang on, if we do this, what's the consequences? And there are no consequences because we're the West and we always win. So we'll win and prevail. And now they're not winning and prevailing. And the consequences are, as you said, deindustrialization, and how Europe particularly, but also the United States, is suffering serious consequences for their actions, because ultimately de-dollarization is the death of the United States. It's as I said, when nations refuse to trade, it refused to buy US debt. Look at Yellen. She went to the Chinese and begged them to buy $850 billion of US treasuries. The Chinese told them, no, go away, we're not doing it. Thanks for coming, but the answer is no.
That 850 billion.
Yes.
But I didn't realize that. I knew she had gone there, and also Kissinger. Yeah, and yeah, that's interesting.
And of course, why do they want them to buy the debt? Because when people keep going, the United States can just keep printing money. Well, yeah, they can,
Yeah,
but
printing
there,
money
but there
to,
are consequences
to
for
buy
doing
all the
so.
commodities for free and
Yeah,
flex their
because
muscles, I
yeah,
guess.
you can't just keep doing it. I mean, this is exactly what Weimar Germany did. Their answer to all their problems: just keep printing, keep printing. You cannot do this. There comes a point, and the United States is now kind of realizing, hence going to China and asking for China to buy all these treasuries, is because they know they've reached a point where you cannot just keep printing. There are
Oh,
consequences.
I thought the China was collapsing. How can the U.S.
Well,
Treasury
yes, and that's
ask,
the other point.
ask China to buy? That's
You know
it.
what?
Ironic, isn't it?
Well, yes, it is ironic. The other thing that the big myth is that with people who believe in the dollar, they think the whole world functions on dollars. They think Chinese companies inside China pay each other in dollars. They don't. They pay each other in RMB. China functions internally on RMB. China doesn't need US dollars. Chinese banks hold US dollars until the point the PBOC picks up the phone because the state only goes, look, you need to dump them because the dollar's, getting a bit too strong. Dump them, buy some US. But they don't keep all the currency that comes in doesn't stay in dollar terms. Businesses there get dollars or increasingly less dollars, but still get dollars. They dump them in because they need yuan because they function inside China. They have to pay Chinese people yuan as wages. But there's this idea that people have that somehow everyone inside China wants dollars. Everyone holds dollars. China needs
Yeah,
dollars.
it's not just China, Paul. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine.
Yeah,
Yeah.
people who like milkshake and stuff like that, saying that the whole world needs dollars. I mean, I don't understand that because they say, oh, because they have dollar debts. Well, they can just default on it, just like Nixon defaulted in 71.
Well, yes, exactly. They will default on it. They'll just walk away and go, well, we don't use your financial system anymore. What are you going to do? Get Moody's to downgrade us to zero? Fine. We don't need credit from your financial system, anymore. We don't need your credit ratings agencies to grant us the privilege of having some dollars to try and resuscitate our failing economy, etc., or financial system, or whatever it might be. That's the problem. They just think that everybody in the world utilizes dollars, and they don't. And of course, what's emboldened the whole anti kind of or has sort of added huge amount of gravity to de-dollarization. Nations are looking at Russia and going, well, actually, look at how well they're doing. Not only are they fighting a war, obviously, but they're in far better shape and have been by not utilizing the dollar, not being subject to the need for dollar denominated debt or taking or and or the risk of having assets frozen. I mean, the one thing I would say is the figures coming out of the West about the amount of assets they froze is nonsense, because the Europeans can only find 30 billion euros worth of Russian assets. They say we don't know where the rest of them are, which well, you either do or you don't. If you don't, that's because they don't exist. So there was a lot of nonsense. That was just propaganda to go, look, we're going to crush Russia. But Russia does very nicely outside the dollar. It's now developing its internal market. So in a way, it's kind of becoming more consumption based. But of course, it has the resources to do this. And it's managing very well outside the dollar. Nations go, you can do this, because this is countering this myth that if you don't utilize the dollar, you're screwed. You can't. It's impossible. No nation can survive.
Yeah. So, Paul,
Well, Russia's proved the point that
yeah.
you can survive and thrive without being part of the dollar-based, financial system.
So just to wrap up, I've got like a two-part question. And also, it's not a question, but also what you, yeah, I guess it is. Well, the first one is, what would you tell the viewers, like the viewers in the US and the UK and the rest of the world, uh, how this multipolarity and de-dollarization is going to affect us in the West? And I personally think we are like a microcosm of the global South in terms in individuals, even in the West. And then the final question, because we have the summit, BRICS summit starting tomorrow. What do you think would be the most like how can I say, what would you say would have the biggest impact on markets and on the on things in general in terms of a comment that they would make at the BRICS summit?
Well, okay, with regards to the BRICS stuff, let's just deal with that first. I mean, Western markets will do everything to suppress any idea that this is going to reshape the perception of financial markets in the West, because they can't allow that to happen, because then they're admitting that in fact the BRICS does have an influence. And really it doesn't matter whether the price of gold goes up $50, $100, or it doesn't. The principal thing that will it come out of the BRICS summit is more about what the global South wants to hear. And it wants to hear that, yes, we are going to include new members. We have to go through a process. How do we do this? And we want inclusion. We want to expand the remit. We're looking, to increase local currencies. Yes, there are discussions about payment systems in BRICS, and by inviting all these nations, it's to make a stand. Look, there are alternatives. There is going to be, there is a new financial architecture. The architecture already exists. The question: how do we roll out? What do we do? That's just putting, the icing on the cake in terms of rolling it out operational. So they're the fundamental points. I mean, the idea of all this gold-backed BRICS currency, all that, no. I mean, if they did it, I'd say it was insane to even at this point suggest that. But it's really just an affirmation to show the global South that the BRICS is gaining traction. Well, I mean, let's look at what the individual speeches are, what the general, the sort of the key takeaways, as you might say, from the summit itself, and what statements issued at the end of it. I mean, it won't be radically different from what we already know now. This will probably upset a bunch of people in the West who thought the BRICS was going to destroy unipolarity in this summit, because it wasn't going to do that, and it never wants to do that, or the perception of doing it directly. But it's just an indication to these nations: you want to join BRICS? Yes. And I think that will be the statement. The idea that someone's going to get announced tomorrow that they're joining a world during the summit in the next few days, it's a possibility, but probably not. But the obvious take might be someone like Iran. I know Saudi Arabia has been asking to just become a full member of, almost like, can we just sign the dotted line and do this? But you might start to see them fleshing out things, talking about commodity exchanges and also the situation, in terms of economic cooperation, and just generally trying to convey to the global South, we are expanding, but we have to do this in a measured way. They don't really care what the West wants to say. BRICS is failed, and so be it. Who cares? It doesn't change anything. It's interesting. Macron wanted to go, and of course they said, no, you're not going. Now there's schools of thought why he wanted to go. People are going, he's trying to spy. Well, there's nothing secret about. Well, the BRICS isn't behind closed doors. Macron's going. Not okay. There's an element that the West wants some eyes as to what's being discussed and what's going on. But I think in certain quarters, there are nations in Europe who are now looking at what's actually going on in the Western financial system, Western economies, bond market, equities, everything, and going, well, we might have to take this seriously. I mean, they won't publicly want to say this, but you're already hearing odd mutterings from Western nations who, like Hungary, for example, who are far less affected by this kind of myopic disease that inflicts Western nations. So I think the point is, let's see specifically what comes out of this, what the discussions are, and not get too bogged down in, well, I didn't hear what I wanted to hear, and I heard contradictions. The nation's saying different things. This is the new reality. It has to happen this way. Nations don't have to agree on everything. And just because they disagree on one point doesn't mean the relationship's over. It's not this idea that, if you're not 100% with us, you're against us, this zero-sum game sort of mentality is just ludicrous. And because that's not how the world will operate in the future. And it is a big mind shift, change for people to see a world that is what I would call democratic in terms of people and nations allowed to make statements and decisions. And yeah, India's not going to agree with everything. Well, it doesn't matter. It's up to India. If India wants to go all in with the United States, then leave them to it. But India has problems. Where does it get its energy from? It needs Russian oil. So, and it wants it cheap because it knows it needs it. So, it's a complex world. Again, nothing's black and white. It's all myriads of shades of grey. And we must guard against seeing something said. And that's the other thing. There were statements attributed to India with regard to the BRICS summit, and the Indians came out and go, we never said that. So, there is certainly fear in the West. So there'll be commentators, the usual publications who will do everything to diss BRICS and say it's a white elephant, it's useless. It's never going to get off the ground. It's already failed. It needs to disband. And you see comments like that, it reeks of fear. They're projecting the fear that this could be a serious threat to us because they, look at Africa and the idea that, if you kick the West out, kick the French out to Sahel region and their access to commodities, and they're in big trouble. So they're going, well, if they become big enough and strong enough as an alternative, they can tell us to basically get lost. And there's nothing we can do about it because we're no longer in the position where it's an isolated nation like the Libyans and Gaddafi or Iraq and Sudan. You can pick these little nations off. But collectively, you can't pick off nations. They're too strong, it's strength of numbers. And, okay, it doesn't boil down to economic data that gives strength. But I mean, it's down to commodities, it's down to resources, it's down to their capability collectively to work together that gives them strength. But militarily, what's the West going to do? Start a war all over the world? I mean, it's basically running out of ammunition to give to the Ukrainians. It's not in a position to fight wars around the world. And all it does is, and they're starting, if we start another war here, then everyone's going to go, oh, look, you're at it again. You're trying to start a war. It will just embolden nations. That nations no longer frightened of the West declaring war on them. They're because they know that in essence, the collective number of nations, and if you look at Africa and the Sahel region, okay, Niger's complicated, and we're not here to discuss Niger today, but there are quite a few nations who are very pro Niger. Okay, you can argue whether a military coup was the right answer or not, but it's not the idea that nations just roll over in Africa the behest of the West. I mean, look at what's happened to France being kicked out of Mali, for example, and effectively being kicked out of Niger. If you'd said this 2 or 3 years ago, no one would have believed you. But again, we're back to the fact all these things people don't believe are happening. So, sorry, what was the first question you had?
Yeah, what would you tell the viewers on a personal basis? Because it's all in good for us to look at de-dollarization and how it would affect, bring on multipolarity. But how do you think individuals like us, protect ourselves?
Oh, okay, yes.
And how will, the de-dollarization impact the West? I think a lot of them know already, but just wanted to get your view on it before we.
Well, obviously, we know the West's going and has been, even pre-2008, really it started, we're not going to go through the history lesson, but it all started with the financialization of Western economies in the 80s, the Thatcher, Reagan in. And we've been going through this slow grind, and we had 2008, and we created this myth and illusion that we resolved all the problems. The West is going through this enormous contraction. It's got huge problems. We can't consume anymore. We can't take on any more debt. And we're not producing things. We're deindustrializing, and all the problems we have. So the future for the West is precarious. The question is, at what point is some nation in the West going to turn around and go, we've had enough of this hostility. Yeah, we don't like Russia. We don't like the Ukraine war. But you know what? We're going to have to move on from this. And at some point it will happen. We want to be, Europe's has a strong desire to cooperate with China. It doesn't want war directly or indirectly with China. But the question is, until that point, we have a very precarious future. It's very uncertain. It depends to what extent all the really horrendously bad decisions we've made with the economy, the financial system, so fiscal monetary policy, to what extent that will impact us. But the risk is it will be severe. So we're back to this situation, and we've said this many times, and when it's not investment advice, as you've also said, Mario, but you have to protect what you've got, whatever that might mean for the individual person. So you need to protect it with real money. This is my opinion, and people will profusely disagree, and that's fine, because it's not about. I don't ever tell people to do anything. They ask me what I've done, and I'll say this is what I do. But don't take my advice. You're just asking the question. So buy gold and silver, and try to have tangible assets to do your best to navigate through these uncertain times. We have to hope that there is limited impact, and that eventually common sense will reign in the West, and people will realize we can't continue doing things the way we have been. But the risk is, how long does that continue? And we could have a lot of political upheaval and social upheaval. And, what does that mean for supply chains? And I don't want to get dystopian about this or trying to create this horrendous kind of scenario of what could happen. But we have to be mindful of this, but not go over the top about it, because equally you have to get on it if you like. But you need to try and make provision for the risk of, we could have supply chain problems. We had some degree of supply chain problems, but the risk is it could get worse. And we just need to be mindful of this, but not to blow it out of proportion. Also, be extremely careful not to get sucked into the big fear game. There's a big fear game in the alternative media because it sells. And also because it's not informing people, it's entertaining people of all these stories that all these things are happening and are going to happen. And be very careful in what you and the people that you regard as being on our side, so to speak, because there are people with a vested interest to tell us a whole bunch of things that are lies. And yet they portray themselves as champions of the people, and they're not champions of the people. They're bought and paid for by the establishment to spread a whole bunch of malicious lies about how they're going to do all these things in the West. All these things are going to happen. And, we're going to have this neo-feudalism. And it's all based on the fact that China has this, and China's taking over the world. And they're going to impose all the things that the Chinese people have imposed on us in the West. This is nonsense. How China's going to impose all that on the West? Just ask one question: how is that even feasible? It's not feasible because it's not happening, and half the things people think happen in China don't happen in China. It's not even reality. So be very guarded, but equally be mindful of the fact there are plenty of things the alt media should be focusing on, and they never talk about the real problems because they're entertainers. They don't understand the reality of what is actually going on. So they entertain you because they're just trying to hide their ignorance of the reality. So all the things financial, economic, Mario, you do a great job yourself and in highlighting a whole bunch of problems for years. and explaining to people what's unfolding. These are the facts we need to be aware of, and understanding how we can best prepare for that, and hope that common sense at some point will prevail. I think politically it will have to happen because the risk is politicians like to survive, and okay, there's the blame game, and they'll accuse everyone else and say the Russians caused it, the Americans caused it, I don't know, someone else caused it. But they're going to have to change their tune because the last thing they want to do, and the risk, is face the wrath of the people of their nation, which has never happened in Western nations for a very long time. So that is going to be a big driver and a catalyst for when that happens, and how that happens will also define this period of uncertainty we'll go through. But as ever, don't let it consume your every waking thought now, because that's not healthy either. But just assess what's going on and make decisions that you're comfortable with, you're happy with, and just try to protect yourself and your loved ones, those that around you, and just let's hope that to some degree some level of common sense prevails. But what I would say is we're in this window where the West could fall apart any day going forward. It doesn't mean it will happen. But tomorrow or next week. But we're entering that window September, October. There's a lot of stuff I'm looking at that I think the risks are higher than we've seen for a very long time. But that doesn't mean it will happen. It just means it's more likely. We have to be careful when we say more likely that we don't interpret that as being a near certainty. But there is that risk, and therefore, and rather like Lehman, even though some of us spent 2 years telling people Lehman was going to happen. Okay, we didn't know it was Lehman, but the point is, we're in that window where we can see things. And for me, there's a lot of things stacking up that suggests the West is suffering serious strain, and are they going to be able to contain that? And okay, it's not resolving it, it's just kicking the can down the road in some capacity. And we have to wait and see what happens. But I also sense fear in the West, which is why they're going out of their way to go, BRICS is useless, China's collapsing, Russia's collapsing, because they're trying to deflect away from their fear of what's happening in the West. And the fear is, well, even if some really awful things happen in the West, remember, you have to stick with us because we're the A team, we're the future. Okay, we're having these problems, but you don't want to go off with the BRICS. You don't want to embrace the global South or China, Russia, or anything. That's why they're doing it. And the timing at the moment and how it's massively increased in the last month or so, I think is tied into this fear that the risks in the West are greater than probably, I think arguably the last time was 2015 into 2016. We had very precarious situation. They kind of bluffed their way through that. I think it's as serious as that, but again, we'll see what happens. But as ever, when something can happen today, tomorrow, or next week, we always have to be mindful of being prepared for the eventuality that could happen. And okay, there's people say, well, people keep saying this and it doesn't happen. Well, yes, but it's simple math. 2 + 2 = 4. The West is unsustainable. And the fact we know comes back to why the US wants proxy wars with Russia and China, because it's telling the world we're in serious trouble. And this is and we have to then threaten 2 major nuclear powers. That's how desperate they are to try and, we think, rectify the situation, and hence why we must diss everything that's to do with multipolarity. But you know what? The Global South doesn't care. They're not interested. And if the West wants to continue to believe that this is a white elephant, it will never succeed, well, fair enough. And yes, there will be problems. It's not a straight linear line to progress and solutions. There will be times, probably in the future, where they make mistakes and they do things wrong. But the point is, they're going to collectively go, that was a bad decision. What are we going to do to rectify it? And they're not going to sit there and pretend, like we do in the West, that everything's fine. The economy's fine. Look, unemployment's low. Look at the Dow. Look at the FTSE. don't look too closely at the bond market thing. Let's just pretend they're okay, and let's ignore the real economic and financial data, etc. They're not going to do that, which is why, just a brief point, China realized their real estate was a farce. So a few years ago, they went, we need to sort this out. Also, our shadow banking's out of control. We need to do something about this. And they started to fix it. And the West doesn't realize that Evergrande was allowed to be let go effectively. They knew Evergrande the problem is, and they just went, okay, we'll just let it go. Okay, it hasn't exactly sunk. Okay, it's filed for bankruptcy in the West, but that's a strategic reason. The issue is, though, they said, look, we're going to let this so-called too big to fails fail, because we're not going to have this situation. We're going to save failing institutions. They're going to have to become leaner, fit to resolve their problems or die. And there's something the West can't comprehend. And therefore, they look at this and go, well, what are they doing? Why aren't they saving it? Or they can't save it. They must be incapable. That means things are even worse. They can't bail out. I mean, the Chinese can print yuan and bail anything up, but they won't do that because that's not their mentality. Hence why when China has problems economically, because it's going through this huge rotation, everyone in the West goes, they must do what we do. What do we do? Stimulus. We just print lots of money and resolve the problem. Oh, they'll do that. No, they won't do that. They don't need to do that. And that's the big kind of, again, this mind shift, that we need to stop looking at everything in terms of what we're doing, and that's the solution. The solutions are going to be very different. So, I understand people are very anxious. They'd love to see, particularly if you're very pro-gold or pro-precious metals, you'd love to see a gold-backed BRICS currency announced. But here's the question. What do you think that would do if they announced it? What are the ramifications of, at this point in time, announcing that? Is that going to be detrimental to BRICS nations? Will it be detrimental to the point that nations will then go, I don't think we want to join the BRICS now? That's a bit of a problem for us. It's an incremental step. So at some point, the Chinese have said gold will be an important component of a new financial system. The Russians have said it. So they've made statements. But again, remember, things can change and they may look at it. And if you absorb all these other nations, like the Saudis and African nations, they might go, well, let's have a commodities back one. So gold might be 5% of it, 10%, 20%, we don't know. And a whole bunch of commodities, but it's going to be backed by effectively real asset, tangible assets, sound money. And that will make it a very robust trading currency for nations. And if 60 nations all work together, then for trading purposes, it would make sense that they all pay each other in BRICS currency as a payment mechanism. I mean, it's logical. It makes complete sense. But these are the kind of discussions, and it's one thing having a 30,000-foot view of this, but when you drill it down in detail, you have to then understand the intricacies and the complexities of what that would mean if we do this. And, Saudi Arabia could turn around and go, well, that's not going to work for us. And here's why. And they'll go, okay, so how do you make it work? And, okay, what does it mean for, and you've got to be a bit careful. You don't have the little elite club of BRICS nations and then you bring the others in and go, oh, sorry. Yeah, you might do, but there's 10 of us, and we're the G10 of BRICS, and we're the decision makers. But equally, you can't have 60 nations all going, well, we don't agree with this, and we want our viewpoint heard, because nothing will ever get resolved. So it's striking the balance, and in essence, having a world that's very different. Nations are not going to be used to working with each other on this in this way, so there's a bit of a learning curve to go, well, hang on, this is very different. We do have a voice. We can disagree with things, and we can have reach a consensus through negotiation and diplomacy. But we're not used to this. What does this mean? How does it work? And and nations are finding actually, like in Africa, well, it works actually quite well. In fact, it works extremely well. But it's a learning curve, and that's why it's a paradigm shift. And as much as anything, it's a reboot in humanity, and in terms of our attitudes, our ideals, the things we value, how we interact with each other, and on a nation by nation basis, interstate, multilateral, bilateral, trilateral. That requires a big shift in attitude as well, and therefore, for some nations, it will be easier than others. But Saudi and Iran's a great example. They've ideologically had this problem. They turn around and go, well, actually, the problem's the United States, not us. Yeah, we have it. Okay, let's work the differences out. And they've made steady progress, but it took years. But now they're moving on. They've now got, defense ministries having talks, trade talks, cooperation in energy, non-energy, etc., and geopolitical issues, regional issues, because they overcame the ideological problems. Now they've removed those, and now they've understood where the trust can be. And yes, we'll have disagreements, but who cares? Because let's focus on the things we agree on and that are mutually beneficial. And then you can break these barriers quickly, but the ultimate challenge will be the West. We're the worst ones for this ideological mindset where we're totally tunnel vision. We're the ones who have to go through the biggest change, and the biggest acceptance is we're no longer top dog. There isn't going to be a top dog. We're going to have to be a really good nation or a great nation amongst equals where we work in cooperation and we both win. And that's how it will be in the future. Now, that's a tough call because many people in the West don't subscribe to it. And not just at governmental level, but also in industry and even on a sort of person, level. There's a lot of people in the West who go, no, we're top dog. We're always going to be running the show. Well, no, you're not, and you're going to have to get used to this. What does this mean? So, as much as anything, what comes out of the BRICS as well has to be a sense of, not just verbal unity, but unity, an idea of cooperation and how we can work together, and really demonstrating to the world there is an alternative. It's real, it's viable, and it's going to work because the will of the nation is to make it work, because we've realized that the sum of our parts is infinitely greater than the individual. And, sometimes it's better to have, 10% of something tangible and real than 100% of something that's worthless. And that, again, something is that the West is going to have to face, that we have to go back to the realization that we need to have tangible assets. We need to produce real things. And all the challenges we face in that regard are enormous. But at some point, I don't doubt we'll get there. It's just, do we want to be the post sort of Yeltsin era, or the post the Yeltsin era with Russia? Okay, and I'm not saying it's extreme. Are we going to have that kind of period of stagnation and no progress, or are we going to grasp the mantle and make rapid changes? Because if the US gets on board, does the right things, you could make rapid progress very, very quickly. If it's resistant, then, and the West stays a dutiful vassal state, then we could be stuck in this quagmire for years. Choice is ours. Well, not necessarily specifically ours, as in everyone listening, but we have the potential collectively to influence that in a peaceful way, not in a violent way, because violence will not solve anything. That really is the quandary we're now facing. And so let's see what happens with BRICS. Let's see what discussions. There'll be an awful lot of information coming out. For me, on the podcast, I will collate it all, find the most interesting bits, and then disseminate what's actually being said in reality, as opposed to, because they often say things and it means something quite different to Western perception. And then, let's see in the coming months as the back end of that, what actual steps they're then going to take And in terms of evolving this organization and finally making it into something that it has the nuts and bolts of. But to me, they've been a bit tame, a bit kind of apprehensive. They haven't really pushed the boat out as far as they can. There's other components of multipolarity that made far quicker steps and far bigger steps. But everyone's fixated on BRICS. But the other point is, BRICS is a very small component of this far bigger puzzle that's now unfolding and has been, ironically, for at least a decade.
Great, Paul. Thank you very much.
Pleasure as ever.
Yeah, and we'll keep an eye on the declarations they make in the next few days. And like you said, it's not gonna, if things are not gonna change overnight. This has been just like other projects like that, they take time, and especially with other countries wanting to join. So yeah, I wish you a great rest of the day, and we'll keep in touch.
Yes, and you too. And yes, we most certainly will.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. And you.